Hey guys, Spirit of the Lie here. In this video, we're going to continue the Through the Ages series, where we look back and comment on how civilizations have evolved from their first release versions until today. This time, we're going to look at the Incas, who were one of the civilizations in the Forgotten mod later made official into the Forgotten expansion DLC. Just to briefly recap the timeline, the Forgotten mod was an unofficial fan-made project released on December 28, 2012. Just a few months later, in April, the unrelated HD remake of AoE 2 was released on Steam, with the Forgotten DLC made official and going up for sale in November of that same year. Now, in my opinion, Incas had a very interesting design from the outset, given their premise was being a jack-of-all-trades civ based around infantry, which, while we have seen before in the game with Japanese as an example and later Malians, Incas had to do it while missing one of the basic military buildings in the stable, making that premise tricky from the outset, requiring multiple unique units, as well as bonuses that would apply to many different situations. At release in 2013, their bonuses were mostly recognizable. They started with a free llama as a civ bonus, which is now their team bonus. Their villagers benefited from blacksmith upgrades, which has an additional restriction on it today for reasons we'll get into. They then had their familiar houses supporting 10 population and buildings costing less stone bonuses. Originally, their team bonus was that their farms were built 50% faster, which became a bit of a meme and was almost comically bad when you crunch the numbers. Reseeding takes just 15 seconds and happens less often as you get mill upgrades, so cutting that time in half often ended up being less than a 1% boost for farmers in the mid to late game. The unique techs were also a little bit different, with couriers giving eagle warriors, slingers, and Kamayuks plus 10% speed and is completely gone today, with then Andean sling to remove skirmisher and slinger minimum range, which has also been tweaked. Notably, back then they were also missing thumbring and keeps, so their arbalesters were a little behind and even towers were almost discouraged past a point. Maybe I shouldn't speak for everyone, but to me they felt like they were the weakest of the American civilizations, certainly at that time, with all the Forgotten civs arguably a little underpowered at the start. That said, there were some creative ideas in here, and the identity for Incas as a counter-focused civilization using cost efficiency and lots of cheap units was always present. Besides having an oppressive tower rush that took a while to catch on, their eagles, slingers, crossbows, and Kamayuks were all noticeably weaker back then for various reasons than those units are for Incas today. And while win rates and stats weren't public at that point, it was pretty clear that Incas needed some help. Their first major overhaul soon came in the African Kingdoms DLC. In that expansion, the Incas' tech tree was broadened, giving them keep, thumbring, block printing, and guilds. The courier's tech, referencing the Incas' advanced use of messengers to send orders throughout the empire, while it was a cute idea and was historically interesting, wasn't particularly impactful in game, and was replaced with a new effect giving those units 1 melee and +2 pierce armor instead of faster movement. This made their eagles extra scary when raiding and against archers, but was a big buff to Kamayuks as well, which could already handle infantry and cavalry when massed up, but with 2 more pierce armor then made them a nice damage sponge against archers, rounding them out as a very nice generalist unit. In addition to this, the elite Kamayuk upgrade was then made cheaper, they were given more bonus damage against camels and elephants, and had their speed increase slightly. It wasn't the full 10% they got previously, but I think most players agreed they were much better at this point, even if the player base was probably collectively sleeping on how good their extra range could be in melee, as it required having a good mass of them to see. This is around the earliest I could find discussions about their villager bonus being used aggressively instead of as a passive defensive boost, with towers being a natural way to expand on that once your villagers are already in your opponent's base. It's easy to forget now, but towers really consumed their identity on the ladder for several years after players caught on to how powerful villagers with extra armor in Feudal Age could be, though it wasn't until Definitive Edition that strategy took over completely. The devs though still weren't quite satisfied with the Kamayuk. With the release of Rise of the Rajas, they were given even more anti-camel bonus damage, though it was also starting to become obvious how much better the courier's armor bonus was than the prior's speed boost. So that cost was also adjusted to double the total resources. This is where Inca stood prior to Definitive Edition, with some interesting unique counter units in the Slinger and Kamayuk, an increasingly popular but not quite yet ubiquitous tower rush, and never really breaking into much of anyone's top 10 best or worst civs. They were most commonly viewed being in the middling B tier, with maybe slightly underappreciated unique units, and Definitive Edition itself didn't immediately bring a lot of changes either. In the whirlwind of almost monthly early DE patches, all that changed was Slinger's attack was decreased from 5 to 4, and Courier's was renamed Fabric Shields, with I suppose technically the Xolotl warrior being a new tech tree addition, if Incas could convert an enemy stable. Big things were on the horizon though. It took almost a year and a half, but by the time of the Lords of the West DLC, the Inca Tower Rush had really taken over their identity, and complaints about it started to hit their peak. The essential problem was Incas had a very nice start with their free llama and fewer houses, which when you combined with their tower discount and extra armor on villagers in feudal, made their towers hit early and be very hard to stop. It ended up being even more disliked than Korean tower rushes, though those also weren't very popular in some circles either. During the early months of 2021, Incas even crept into the top 5 by win rate, carried on the back of some very optimized builds that took full advantage of their tower rushing bonuses. The devs' response was a little delayed, but ultimately decisive, and a patch released shortly after Lords of the West effectively ended Inca Tower shenanigans with a slight tweak to their villager bonus for blacksmith upgrades to not kick in until Castle Age, with nothing else given in compensation. Suddenly, their tower rushes could be fought off like anyone else's. With that meme strategy crushed, and Incas having to stand on the strength of more conventional units, the developers got back to their regularly scheduled programming of buffing Kamayuks. The next major patch, along with the Dawn of the Dukes DLC release, gave non-elite Kamayuks plus 10 HP and 1 more melee armor. This wasn't just to encourage that unit specifically, but this whole patch was remembered as the big push for nearly all infantry unique units in Castle Age, as part of the overarching 2022 and 2023 overhaul for infantry in general. At this point, they could have just left Incas as the jack-of-all-trades counter unit civ with an eclectic mix of eco and defensive bonuses. Incas were fine, and back to their intended design instead of an unintended tower-rushing meme civilization. The devs had a few more big shakeups in mind though, happening in 2 major waves. First, with the release of Dynasties of India, in addition to releasing 3 new civs, it had an accompanying massive overhaul patch affecting almost half of civilizations in the game. Incas were in that list, with the devs removing the ridiculed 50% faster constructed farm team bonus, replacing it with spearmen and skirmishers having +2 line of sight. This basically switched an F-tier team bonus for a D-tier one, but opened the doors to a later, more significant change. Shortly after this, Thumbring was also reworked, leading to the Slinger starting to benefit from it with a faster attack rate. While that didn't technically make sense with Slingers not using arrows, to be fair, crossbows and Chukunu also benefit from Thumbring, so it was a quirk with some precedent. The big overhaul though came with a massive update in April 2023, with almost every single civilization changed in some way. This was a huge one for Incas, with 3 major areas of focus. First, Slingers were no longer affected by Thumbring, though now the unique tech Andean Sling would give them +1 attack. While that has little effect compared to their +10 bonus against infantry, it makes that particular tech more important in other matchups. The second was their team bonus for more line of sight on spear and skirmisher units was replaced with giving a free llama to all teammates from the start of the game. Now the Incas team bonus went from a D tier to maybe even A tier, giving everyone on the team a clear starting advantage every game with more consistent early food. The third major change was a new civ bonus, giving Incas a pretty hefty food discount on their military units, though with some offsetting changes like removing supplies and slightly raising the base food cost of Kamayuks. The net effect of all these changes was incredibly positive. Incas were back as a very strong 1v1 civ, this time not riding a cheesy villager rush, but instead thanks to a strong food economy. Maybe a little too strong if anything. In a follow-up biggest winners and losers video covering that mega patch, I had Incas as the second biggest winner, going from number 20 on Arabia by the stats immediately up to number 4, accompanied maybe unsurprisingly by a spike in play rate. In terms of performance, Incas were suddenly the best American civilization by far, particularly because the cost of the Eagle Warrior went up by 5 food in that same patch, which was felt by Aztecs and Mayans, but not Incas, given their new food discount. You could argue Incas were already fine, but what I really like about this sequence of changes is it found a way to take the counter-unit cost efficiency part of the Incas' identity and just lean into it even more. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but it also found a way to incentivize basically every unit except archers and siege, encouraging you to not just fall into a meta play with crossbows into Arb and siege ram, but instead explore some of the Incas' other options. As we saw by the stats though, it went maybe a little too far, and perhaps unsurprisingly with the Mountain Royals DLC patch, the Inca food discount was reduced by 5% per age, with a little tweak to the Kamayuk's cost downward to again try to encourage that unit. Compared to its release, it's amazing how many buffs have been applied to that unit in particular, and at this point, I don't think it's controversial to say most players realize it's now a very good unit when massed in melee battles, and is even fairly resistant to archers after their unique tech. This all leaves us with where Incas stand today. Based on the current stats, they still appear to be the best American civ on the ladder, and across all maps are generally a top 10 civ, or right on the borderline, recently around number 15 on Arabia specifically. Likewise, in recent tournaments, they're pretty middle of the road in both pick and win rate. They're just a well-balanced civ, with a clear identity and a very useful team bonus now, even if they're not your prototypical paladin or top-tier archer civ, which are generally preferred in team games. So that's a retrospective look at the Incas and how they've evolved over the years. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.